Okay, this podcast is going to focus on rivers and river features, including erosion and depositional features. So your objectives are, first, you'll be able to explain how streams and rivers cause erosion and move sediment. And you also will be able to describe landforms created by rivers. And I've listed the ones you'll need to know: deltas, V-shaped valleys, floodplains, meanders, oxbow lakes, and alluvial fans. Now you can find most of these in Chapter 6, Section 2 of your textbook, but for alluvial fans, it's in a separate section in your book about deserts, because that's where they happen. So look them up in the index if you need more information. So first off, streams and rivers, some definitions. A stream is a body of water that moves downslope in a channel, and a river is just one type of stream. So you might hear about creeks or gullies. These are all types of streams. A river is a term for the largest type of stream. I'm probably going to use those words interchangeably. Just know that a river is a type of large stream. All of these flow from high elevation to low elevation. There's a common misconception that all rivers flow from north to south. That's not true. It doesn't really matter which way a river goes, north, south, east, or west. It's always going to go from high to low, from the mountains to sea level. So just like air pressure with wind, the wind will blow from high to low. Streams will flow from high to low. A couple terms I'm going to use. The place where a river begins is called its source, and the place where a river ends in a lake or in the ocean is called its mouth. So as it moves from the source to the mouth, streams are going to do some erosion. So first off, it might just pick up loose material. There might be sediment already there because of weathering, so it'll just pick it up and move it along. Or because of abrasion, it can scrape off or loosen the material itself, so it can make the weathering happen and the erosion at the same time. The other thing it'll do is dissolve some rock. So let's say the river goes through a deposit of rock salt. That's something that's soluble in water, so it'll dissolve it and move it right along. So this is how it removes material. Then there are 3 different ways that it can carry the sediment or carry the material. So if this is the way the stream is going, and it's a little turbulent, it's moving along, there are 3 types of load. This is the sediment load the river is carrying. There's the dissolved load. So that's the stuff that's just dissolved in the water and it moves as the water moves. Then there's the suspended load. Those are sediment particles that are small enough that they can be carried within the water itself. So if you see a river that appears brown or red because it's carrying a lot of sediment, that's the suspended load you're seeing, the stuff that's up here in the water. The last type is the bed load. That's the sediment that either hops or skips or rolls along the bottom. You don't need to know these 3 terms. They're just different ways that it scoots or skips or rolls along the bottom. You just need to know that the bed load is the stuff moving along the bottom. So if the stream is moving more quickly, it's able to carry more in its suspended load, and it's also able to push more in its bed load. Now for deposition, when the water slows down, that's when the sediment is going to settle out of the water. So this can happen along the river channel if it slows down. It can also happen at the mouth of the stream. When the river slows down, it's not able to carry as much in its suspended load. It's also not able to push as much in its bed load. Now you'll see as a stream moves from its source, which they're calling the headwaters, towards the mouth, up in the mountains by the source, it's going to have a steeper gradient. So it's going to be moving downhill much more quickly. Here at the mouth, it's a lot flatter, and so it's going to kind of lazily move along. You're going to get different river features forming near the source than at the mouth because it's going to cut deeper channels when it's moving downhill in the mountains, and it's also going to be looping along more lazily here where there's a more gentle gradient. The term for these loops are called meanders. So a meander means to wander, and so the river tends to kind of wander across the landscape. when it's down at more gentle gradient. So let's start near the source. Your first river feature you'll need to know is a V-shaped valley, and your textbook calls it a narrow valley. So this is formed by erosion. These tend to form up in the mountains, so near the source. And what happens is erosion by the river cuts downwards and creates the steep valley, and then weathering is going to weaken the sides and turn it into a V shape. This is a classic river feature shape. So if you're looking at a valley and it has a V, then you know that a river formed it. There are other types of valleys that are formed by glaciers or by earthquakes, and they have different shapes. So V shape means that the river formed it. V-shaped valleys tend to form up here by the headwaters. A floodplain, which is called a wide valley in your textbook, is formed by both erosion and deposition, and it's a lot flatter. So here you can see a wide, flat floodplain. What happens is, during a flood, the floodplain will get covered with water and sediment gets deposited on it. And so it kind of smooths itself out every single time there's a flood. Floodplains tend to happen down here towards the mouth of the river. Because it gets covered with water during flooding times, floodplains tend to be a really good place for farming because the floodplain gets a lot of really good soil deposited on it. On the floodplain, you're going to see two different features forming, meanders and oxbow lakes. So first, meanders, it's a bend in the river. And the way that this forms is water is going to erode more on the outer bank than on the inner bank. That's because the water on the outside is moving faster and the water on the inside is moving slower. Another way to think of it is if you are running track, to do one loop of the track on the outside lane, you're going to be going a farther distance than if you run a loop of the track on the inside lane. So in order to go around in the same amount of time, you have to run faster if you're on the outside than if you're on the inside. For that reason, the water goes faster around the outside and slower on the inside. So it's going to erode here and deposit here. What that does is it makes the meander more and more curvy over time. Here's a floodplain with lots of meanders on it. And this is a pretty typical view. Notice it's here, flat, not up in the mountains. Eventually, meanders get so curvy that it's not efficient for the river anymore. And so the meanders will get cut off, and the leftover meander becomes an oxbow lake. So during a flood, the river will then cut a straight path, and the leftover meander is here as an oxbow lake. Think about it this way. It takes a lot of energy for the river to go all the way around here. So when it floods, this river might cut across this very narrow neck of land, straighten out, and then this meander would be left behind as an oxbow lake. If you feel like you need a better explanation of how meanders and oxbow lakes form, there's a link to an animation on the website, and that animation goes through in really good detail and shows it really well. So these are things that happen on the floodplain. Now let's talk about what happens at the mouth. But first, this shows how a river will meander across the landscape lazily. Over time, the river channel changes and changes and changes. And so this is the floodplain showing all of the old meanders. This is a natural process. So flooding and river channel changing happens naturally all the time. Now, if you have a city on a river, they don't like that so much, but naturally it's a healthy process for the river. Okay, now let's go to the mouth. At the mouth of the river, you have a delta form. This is the delta of the Mississippi. Here's New Orleans right there. And this is the delta of the Nile River in Egypt. You'll notice that both of them have this kind of vaguely triangle shape. And that's where a delta gets its name. The Greek letter delta is a triangle, and so that's where the name comes from. So what happens is the river is going to reach the ocean. That'll slow it down, and when it slows down, it deposits its sediments. You learned during our sedimentary rocks unit that the big stuff will be deposited closer to shore, whereas the smaller grains head out farther into the water, as you can see here in this picture. The last feature is very similar to a delta. It's formed by deposition, and it happens at the end of a stream, but under very different circumstances. In a very dry area, an alluvial fan will form when a stream comes out of the mountains onto flat land. And so here's an example where you've got a stream that comes out of the mountains and spreads out into a triangle shape or a fan shape and deposits its sediment here on land rather than into the ocean. So it's the same process, but in a different environment. So the shape is similar, but you find these on land rather than finding them in the ocean or in a lake. So these are the features that are created by erosion and deposition of a river. And you're going to practice them with our Google Earth activity. You're going to be finding them in satellite images and figuring out which river features you're looking at.